Hello and welcome to a special BriefingsDirect podcast coming to you from the 2017 SAP Ariba Live Conference in Las Vegas. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Intra Arbor Solutions, your host here the week of March 20 as we explore the latest in collaborative commerce and learn how innovative companies are leveraging the networked economy. Our next Digital Business Insights discussion explores new ways that companies are gaining improved visibility, analytics, and predictive responses to better manage supply chain risks. We'll examine how companies such as Nielsen are using cognitive computing search engines and even machine learning and artificial intelligence to reduce risk in their overall buying and acquisitions. To learn more about the exploding sophistication in gaining insights into advanced business commerce, please join me now in welcoming our guests. We're here with James Edward Johnson, Director of Supply Chain Risk Management and Analysis at Nielsen. Welcome, James.
Thank you for having me.
We're glad you're with us. We're here as well with Dan Adamson, founder and CEO of OutsideIQ in Toronto. Welcome, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Dana.
And lastly, we're here with Padmini Ranganathan. She's the Vice President of Products and Innovation at SAP Ariba. Welcome.
Glad to be here, Dana.
Padmini, let's start with you. We heard here at Ariba Live that risk is opportunity. That kind of stuck with me. Are the technologies really now sufficient that we can fully examine risks to such a degree that we can turn that into a significant business competitive advantage? That is to say, those who really take on risks seriously, can they really have a big jump over their competitors?
I come from the Valley, so of course we have to take risks for startups to grow into big businesses, and we've seen a lot of successful entrepreneurs do that. So clearly taking risks drives bigger opportunity. But in this world of supplier and supply chain risk management, it's even more important and imperative that the buyer and supplier relationships is risk aware and risk free. The more transparent that relationship becomes, the more opportunity for driving more business between those relationships. And that context of growing businesses and as well as growing the trust and transparent relationships in the supply chain is better managed by understanding the supply base, and so understanding the risks in the supply base and then converting them to opportunities to mitigate, solve the problems jointly, collaborate together, and form that partnership, really.
Dan, it seems that what was once acceptable risk can now be significantly reduced. How do people in procurement and supply chain management now know what acceptable risk is, or maybe they shouldn't accept any risk?
My roots are also from the Valley, and I think you're absolutely right that at times you should be taking risks, but not unnecessarily. And I think what the procurement side has struggled with, and this is from me jumping from into financial institutions where they treat risk very differently through to procurement. They really struggle with risk versus the price point to avoid that risk. And that's been traditionally the big problem. If for every vendor that you're onboarding, you have to pay for a $1,000 due diligence report, it's really not price effective. And to be able to maintain and monitor that on a regular basis, there's a real risk versus reward versus cost discussion in there. And what's really happened, what we're helping drive, and I think what you're seeing out there, are a new set of technology solutions that enable a deeper level of due diligence through technology, through cognitive computing that wasn't previously possible at the price point that really makes it cost effective to really clamp down and try to avoid the risk where necessary and now possible.
And James, as a consumer of some of these technologies, do you really feel that there's been a significant change in that value equation, that for less money output, you're getting a lot less risk input?
To some degree, I think the value was always there. It was just difficult to help people see that value. Obviously, tools like this will help us see that value more readily. It used to be that in order to show the value, you actually had to do a lot of work, maybe with a vendor, maybe more. It was challenging. what we're talking about here is beginning to boil the ocean, right? You can test these products, and you can do a lot of work just looking at test results. And it's a lot easier to see the value because you will unearth things that you couldn't see in the past. So what used to take a full-blown implementation to even begin to grasp those risks, today you can just test your data and see what you find. And I think most people, once they have their eyes wide open, will be at least a little more fearful. But at the same time, and this goes back to the opportunity question you asked, they'll see the opportunity to actually tackle these risks. It's not like those risks didn't exist in the past. Now they just know that they're there, and they can do something about it or not.
So rather than avoid the entire process, now you can go at the process, but with more granular tools to assess your risks and then manage them properly.
That's right. And I wouldn't say that we should have a risk-free environment. Right? That would cost more money than we're willing to pay. That said, we should be more conscious of what we're not paying for, right? So rather than just leave it out there in the void, where you can't access information about what you don't know, now you'll know something, and it's your choice to decide whether or not you want to go down the route of eliminating that risk, living with that risk, or maybe something in between. And that's where I think the sweet spot is. There's probably a lot of intermediate actions that people could be taking now that are very cheap, but they don't even think to do it because they haven't assessed where the risk is.
Padmini, because we're looking at a very complex landscape, a supply chain, global supply chain, many tiers, when we have a solution, it seems that it's a team sport, an ecosystem approach. As a network, as a supplier and a platform, tell me what SAP Ariba has done, what your news is here at Ariba Live, and why it is so important to be a team player when it comes to a fuller risk reduction opportunity.
Absolutely. So you said it right. The risk domain world is large, and it is it's specialized. The language that the compliance people use in the risk world is very different from the language that somewhat similar to the language that the lawyers use, but very different from the language that the IT, the security and information security risk teams use. The reason why you can't see many of the risks is partly because the data and the information and the fragmentation was too broad, too wide, but also partly because the type of risks and the people who deal with these risks are also scattered across the organization. And so a platform that supports bringing all of this in is number one. Second, the platform supports the end-to-end process of managing that supplier relationship and managing to the end tier, the supplier's supply chain and the transparency in there. So that's where Ariba is headed with direct materials and with getting more into supply chain collaboration that you've heard at SAP Ariba Live. You will see that we start to understand that supply chain much better because you're in Ariba, and then you have this ecosystem of partners and providers. You have the technology with SAP and HANA. We now have the technology to mash up big data and set it in context, understand the patterns. And we have the open ecosystem and the open source platform to allow us to take that even wider. And last but not the least is the network. So it's not just the between one company and another company, it's a network of companies operating together. So if the momentum starts to generate when everyone's operating in this environment to say, okay, I'm going to push for finding those ethical companies to do business with. And that's really where the power multiplies, and the multiplier is right there.
Right. Dan, when a company nowadays buys something in a global supply chain, they're not just buying a product, they're buying everything that's gone on with that product, the legacy of that product, if you will, from cradle to PO. What is it that OutsideIQ is bringing to the table that helps them get a better handle on what that legacy really is?
Yeah, and they're not just buying from that seller. They're buying from the seller that sold to that seller, and they're buying a lot of history there, and there's a lot of potential risk behind the scenes. So really, I think why this has been manual to do this previously is because there's a lot of context or pulling out those needles from the haystack that required a human level of digging, of context to get to those needles. And the exciting thing that we're bringing is a cognitive computing platform that is trainable, and it's been trained by fin crimes experts and corporate compliance experts and increasingly supply management experts on what to look for. And it has the ability to learn about its subject, so it can go deeper. It can actually pivot on where it's searching. It finds a presence in Afghanistan. Well, that's a risk in itself potentially, but it can then go dig deeper on that. And that level of deeper digging is something that really a human had to do before. And so this is the exciting revolution that's occurring. Now we can bring back that data. It can be unstructured, it could be structured, but we can piece it together and provide some structure that is then returned to Ariba. And the great thing about the supply management risk platform or toolkit that's being launched here is that there's another level of context on top of that, where they understand the relationship between the supplier and the buyer, and that's an important context as well to apply. How you risk score on top of that is very critical to weed out all of that noise. Otherwise, it would be a huge data science exercise, and everyone would be spinning their wheels. So, this is now a huge opportunity for clients like James to truly get some low-hanging fruit value, where previously it would have been literally a witch hunt, right, or a huge mining expedition, and now we're able to achieve this level of value.
Excuse me, James. Dan has just described what others are calling investigative cognitive computing brought to bear on this supply chain risk problem. As someone who's in the business of trying to get the best tools for their organization, where do you come down on this? How important is it to you, and what have you been able to do with it?
I think it's very important. I have done the kinds of investigations that he's talking about where, for example, if I'm looking at a vendor in a high-risk country, right, particularly a small vendor that doesn't have an international presence that is problematic for most suppliers, what do? I will go and do some of the investigation that Dan is talking about. Now, I'm usually sitting at my desk in Chicago. I'm not going out into the world. So there's a heightened level of due diligence that I suspect neither of us are really talking about here. But the reality is you want to look up not only the people, you want to look up all their connections, right? You might have had a due diligence form completed, but right, that's an interested party giving you information. What do you do with it? Well, I can run the risk on not only the entity that I'm transacting with, I'm going to run on everyone that they've even mentioned. Then I'm going to look up all the LinkedIn profiles, see who they're connected to, right? And do any of those people show any red flags? Look at the bank that they use. Are there any red flags with their bank? I can do all that work. And I can spend several hours doing all that work. As a lawyer, I might dig a little deeper than someone else, but in the end, it's human labor going into the effort.
And that really doesn't scale very well.
That does not scale at all. I'm not going to hire a team of lawyers for everything. The reality here, though, is that I can do some level of that with every supplier with the kind of technology that Dan is talking about. I haven't had a huge opportunity yet to work with his technology, but the promise of it is incredible, and it's because of relationships like the one that is happening between SAP Ariba and OutsideIQ that I see this as a really great relationship for me to have with SAP Ariba, because we're both kind of on the same roadmap. I have a lot of work to do. They have a lot of work to do, and quite honestly, the work will never end. And that's okay. We just need to be comfortable with it and work together to build a better world.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about Nielsen. I know it's a big company. For our listeners and readers to understand your business. And then secondarily, what part of your procurement, your supply chain, do you think this will impact best first? That is the low-lying fruit for the value here.
Yeah, so Nielsen is a market research company. We answer two questions. What do people watch and what do people buy? It sounds very simple. But when you cover 90% of the world's population, which we do, over 6 billion people, you can imagine it gets a little bit more complicated. I came from finance for our technology area. I can tell you we have about 54 petabytes of database data, right? So the scale there is huge. We have 43,000 employees. It's not a small company. You might know it for the set-top boxes that you think of as being in the U.S., and they tell you what the ratings were overnight for the Super Bowl. It's a lot more than that. And you can imagine, especially when you're trying to answer, what do people buy in Kenya or Sudan, right? You're touching some riskier things. In terms of what it can solve for us, I think the first quick hit is just we will no longer have to, every time, leverage multiple sources of information. Right? I can now leverage all the sources of information at one time through one interface that's already being used to deliver information to people who are involved in the procurement chain. That's the huge quick win. The secondary win, though, is that second level of effort that we can put in. But from the efficiency that we get in doing that first layer, now we can start to address that middle tier that I mentioned. How do we more specifically respond to certain kinds of risk that today maybe we're doing ad hoc, but we're not doing it systematically. And it's that systematic change that allow us to not only target the 100, 200 vendors that we might prioritize, but the thousands of vendors that are somewhere in our system. Mm-hmm. That's going to revolutionize things, and especially once you fold in the ESG work that today, the environmental, social, and governance work that is very, very focused for us now. If I can spread that out to the whole supply chain, that's revolutionary. And there are a lot of low-cost things that you can do if you just have the information. So it's not always a question of, am I going to do good in the world and how much is it going to cost me? It's really a question of, what is the good in the world that's freely available to me that I'm not even touching? That's amazing, and that's the kind of thing that you can go to work for and be happy about your work and not just do what you need to do to get a paycheck.
Right. It's not just avoiding the bad things. It's the false positives that you want to remove so that you can get the full benefit of a diverse, rich supplier network to choose from.
Right. And today we are essentially wasting a lot of time on what are suspected false positives, or what are suspected positives, we turn out that they're false. Right? We waste information on them because we go deeper with a human than we need to. Let's let the machines go as deep as they can, and then let the humans come in to take over from there.
So, Padmini, it's interesting to me that he's now talking about making this methodological, standardized, part of due diligence that's not ad hoc, it's not exception management. What's the next step? And we've seen some of that here today for making this easier to consume. So we're thinking about the user experience, the interface. How can we make this that a systemic, rich, easy to use, everyday tool?
Sure. So the first step was the data. I mean, it is the plumbing. We have to get that right. And along with the data is all of the way you look at your master data, which is suppliers, the way you look at what you're buying, which is categories of spend, and where you're buying from, which is all the regions. And so you've already got the matrix segmentation of that master data. And that's something that you saw today at when Sudhir demonstrated the matrix level of segmentation, qualification, everything else that you can do with SAP Ariba. The next step is then the process, because it's really not a one-size-fits-all. And I mean it. I think I've repeated it many times today, but it's not. It cannot be a one-size-fits-all where you start every supplier that you onboard, you're going to ask them the same set of questions, check the box, and move on. So if there is an engagement that you're having with, and I'm going to use the print service vendor again, which is my favorite, for just marketing materials printing, you have a certain level of risk, and that's all you need to look at. But you still want to, of course, look at them for any adverse media incidents or whether they suddenly got on a watch list for something. You do want to know that. But you also, when one of the business units start to use them for customer confidential data and statement printing, for example, in a bank, the level of risk shoots up. So the intensity of risk assessments and the risk audits and things that you would do with that vendor for that level of risk has to be engineered and geared to that type of risk. So it cannot be a one size fits all. It has to go past the standard. So the standardization is not in the process. The standardization is in the way you look at risk, so that you can determine how much of the process do I need to apply, and I can stay in tune.
So, Dan, clearly SAP Ariba, Nielsen, they want the dials. They want to be able to tune this in, use their algorithmic approach, get that methodology, but they need the right data. They need the assessment. The opening innings is all I think we're at now for cognitive computing, for AI, for machine learning. Tell me what's coming next. What should we expect in terms of what you can bring to the table and other partners like yourselves in bringing the rich inference and understanding that these other organizations want?
I think we are definitely early days on the one hand, but on the other hand, we've seen historically many AI failures where we failed to commercialize AI technologies, and this time it's a little different because of the big data movement, because of the sort of well-known use cases in machine learning that have been very successful, pattern matching and recommending and classifying. We're using that as a backbone to build on top of that layers of cognitive computing. And I think, as Padmini said, we're providing a first layer and we're getting stronger and stronger. We can weed out up to 95% of the false positives to start from and really let the humans look at the thorny or potential thorny issues that are left over. That's a huge ROI and time savings by itself. But on top of that, you can add in another layer of cognitive computing, and that might be at the workflow layer that recognizes that data and says, geez, just a second here, there's a confidentiality potential issue here. Let's treat this vendor differently, and let's go as far as plugging in a special clause into the contract. Right. This is, I think, where Ariba is going with that. And so it's building a layer of cognitive computing on top of another layer of cognitive computing. And actually, human processes work like that, too. There's a lot of fundamental pattern recognition at the sort of basis of our cognitive thought. And on top of that, we layer on top logic. And so it's a fun time to be in this field. We are revolutionizing, but it's one layer at a time, and it's an exciting approach.
It sure seems like the next few years we're going to be searching for that right balance of what the humans can do best and the machines can do best and how to apportion that properly. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. We've been talking about new ways that companies are gaining improved visibility, analytics, and predictive responses to better manage their supply chain risks. And we've learned how companies such as Nielsen are using cognitive computing, engine searches, and even machine learning and AI to reduce risk in their overall buying and acquisitions. So a big thanks to our guests. We've been here with James Edward Johnson, Director of Supply Chain Risk Management and Analysis at Nielsen. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Dana. It's been great.
And we've been here as well with Dan Adamson, Founder and CEO at OutsideIQ in Toronto. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And lastly, we're here with Padmini Ranganathan. She's the Vice President of Products and Innovation at SAP Ariba. Thank you so much, Padmini.
Thank you, Dan.
And a big thank you as well to our audience for joining this special podcast coming to you from the 2017 SAP Ariba Live Conference in Las Vegas. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inner Arbor Solutions, your host throughout this series of SAP Ariba-sponsored BriefingsDirect Digital Business Insights discussions. Thanks again for listening, and do come back next time.